Hi, Mrs. Brown here. I wanted to go through a little bit on language since we've already talked about memory and cognition. So language is defined as our spoken, written, or gestured words and the way we combine them to communicate meaning. So this unit's all about understanding how we think, how we solve problems, and so we want to understand, number one, how does language develop? And there are several different theories on that. And then also, how does language influence our culture and also influence the way that we think, or does the way that we think influence language? And so we're going to talk about some of that right now. Okay, how do we learn how to speak? We go through language acquisition, and there are stages that we go through. So I'll just put all these up for you, and you can pause the video if you want to write this stuff down. You're like, oh, my little baby things. Okay, so the first stage is the babbling stage, where, babies are kind of making noises and babbling, but you don't exactly know. It doesn't sound like a word. It just sounds like babbling. Then the second stage is the holophrastic stage. Hollow meaning the one-word stage. So they will label things: dog, cat, mama, cup. And then after that, then they get into the third stage, which is the telegraphic speech stage, where they're combining words. Usually it's like about two or three words together. And then after that, what they do is they're speaking, relatively normally, but they use words kind of in grammatically incorrect ways because they go through something called overregularization, which is something that you want to think about. I think several questions where you'll have an example of overregularization on your test, and you need to identify it as that. So, it's these kind of over application of grammar rules to the point where they're actually using grammar incorrectly. And it is during the telegraphic stage. So we're looking at toddlers and very young children. An example of overregularization could be like, I goed to the park instead of I go to the park, or I went to the park. Instead of I went to the park, I goed to the park. Or I sweeped the floor instead of I swept the floor. So that's an example of overregularization that happens in the telegraphic speech stage. A little bit more on language development. Okay, just so you can get kind of the ages, we did 1, 2, and 3, but the babbling stage is around 5 or 6 months old. It's spontaneous sounds, but it's not, it doesn't mean anything necessarily. It's limited to the phonemes of the infant's household language. So, English or whatever language they're growing up speaking. The one-word stage is, between 1 and 2. We call these toddlers, and they're using one word and labeling things and trying to communicate that way. And then 2-word telegraphic speech usually starts around age 2 and goes through those toddler years where they're using 2 words to communicate. And again, we see overregularization in the telegraphic speech stage. Here's another example. You are the bestest. You are my bestest mom. Okay, here's a little question for you. Which of the following is a hollow phrase 1-year-old Amanda is likely to say? Okay, remember holophrastic, one word. Okay, so the answer here would be bottle. Okay, gaga and are examples of babbling, and eat apple is an example of the 2 words face. All right, how do we learn language? So there are several theories out there on how we learn language. You have kind of the behavioral school, specifically B.F. Skinner, that talks about how we are taught language through how we're conditioned, through, how we are rewarded and our experiences with that. That is what helps us learn language. So that's kind of one theory. You also have another school of thinking where you have Noam Chomsky. And Noam Chomsky talked about, and this is called the nativist theory. He talked about how we have this innate ability to learn language, and that really nothing can stop us from learning language. If we are exposed to language and we hear it, we're going to pick it up. And so he did this little like thing where he talked about your inborn voice box and your language acquisition device, and how, babies will learn language as long as they're exposed to language. So we have those two kind of different schools of thinking, the behaviorist school versus the nativist school of thinking. Okay, we have English, Chinese, whatever. I'm just giving you a little graphics. Okay, social learning theory. All right, so remember we talked about Bandura, who did the Bobo doll experiment. So he did the social learning theory, but B.F. Skinner kind of falls into this simply because he's a behaviorist. So we kind of just put him into this category. Again, based on what you're exposed to, how you're rewarded and punished, and modeling too. So remember, Bandura talked a lot about in his social learning theory, you model language and behavior. So a baby may imitate the parent. And then B.F. Skinner talked about reinforcement. And so if they're reinforced to keep saying the word, then they'll say it. But if they're punished, then they might stop saying the word. So that's kind of that behavioral view, using operant conditioning to teach language. Here's Chomsky's nativist theory. I just talked about this. All right, we learn language quickly. And so it's too quick to be through reinforcement and punishment, according to Chomsky. He thought that we have this inborn ability, this language acquisition device, or this voice box that helps us to learn language, and we're just going to learn it. Benjamin Whorf is another person we want to talk about with language. He came up with this theory called linguistic relativity. You may also see or hear it called linguistic determinism. So you should recognize linguistic relativity or linguistic determinism. This is the idea that language actually influences the way that we think. Okay, so according to Whorf, language actually shapes a culture's concepts. It shapes the culture's thought processes, and it determines how we think. So if we're, trying to come up with different concepts and different schemas and whatever, language actually helps us determine that stuff. So it clearly helps us determine the way that we think. And here's just a little example. The Hopi tribe has no past tense in their language. And so Benjamin Whorf said, he thinks that culture rarely thinks about the past, and that might be kind of part of that culture, and that is reflected in their language, and also their language helps to influence the way that they think too. So it's kind of cyclical. All right, getting into the different parts of language, phonemes and morphemes. Okay, phonemes are the smallest distinctive units of sound, and morphemes are the smallest distinctive units that have meaning. So looking at, a prefix, a suffix, things like that. So phonemes, the smallest distinctive unit of sound. And, I like to give you guys little tricks. So I think phones make sound. You can hear a phone ring. Phones make sound, the smallest distinctive units of sound. So ch-ug has 3 phonemes. C-H, U, and the D. Ch-ug. So you can figure out the smallest distinctive units of sounds, and that's how many phonemes a word has. Morphemes, like I said, morphemes think meaning. Morpheme starts with an M, meaning starts with an M. Okay, so the smallest unit that carries meaning. And again, I like to really look for prefixes or suffixes, things that you can really break down to say, okay, I know this try means 3, so that's 1 morpheme. Or looking at the different suffixes as well. Untying. Okay, untying. So we have the word un, okay, and then we have ing, which is a suffix, so there's 2 morphemes. Grammar. Okay, we define grammar as, English teachers, this is the psychological definition of grammar, a system of rules in a language that enables us to communicate and understand others. And so it is possible you might have to know the definition of grammar at some point or another. So you might want to learn that. Semantics, however, are kind of the rules. So when you hear semantics, I know we've talked a lot about semantic stuff. So we did like semantic encoding, giving us meaning, thinking of how it's important to us or how it applies to our life when we're encoding information. We talked about semantic memory, right? And now we're looking at semantics. So make sure you keep all these things straight. It's a set of rules by which we derive meaning in a language. So really, if you just think of meaning for semantics and for semantic encoding, that'll work really well for you. When you look at semantic memory, you have to go back and look at declarative, explicit memory and break that whole thing down. So just keep all these things straight for you. Here's an example. If you add ed at the end of the words, it means past tense. So these are just rules that we have in our language, and each language kind of has its own rules that help us to understand the meaning within that language. So here's an example. The Chinese languages do not have expansive semantic rules. They usually have totally different symbols for different tenses. So Chinese, good for you, because that is some difficult stuff. Syntax are the rules for combining words into grammatically sensible sentences. Okay, and so in English, we know that adjectives come before nouns, but in Spanish, it's the other way around. And so we have these rules, not for meaning, but just to make sure that our sentences make, sense grammatically. Is this the White House or the House White, right? I think in Spanish, it's a little rusty. It'd be like Casablanca, but in English, obviously, it's White House. No, I did it right. Okay. Which is the smallest unit? These are practice questions. The smallest unit meaning in a language. Okay. Meaning M, morpheme M. Good. The answer is B. Unlike B.F. Skinner, Noam Chomsky believed that children, learn to speak by mimicking the sounds around them. No, that would be Bandura in social learning, behaviorism. Speak more quickly if their parents correct their mispronunciations. That would be B.F. Skinner. Would also be B.F. Skinner, okay, using rewards. So the answer is C, are hardwired for language acquisition. So hopefully you feel good. This language stuff is really simple, and if you know all of this, you should be good for your test, for your AP exam. Just keep in mind, the different theories, behaviorism versus nativism. Keep in mind Benjamin Whorf and linguistic determinism or linguistic relativity. Keep in mind morphemes and phonemes. Be able to pick those out, like if you had an example. And then those different stages of language acquisition, the babbling stage or pre-linguistic stage, the holophrastic or one-word stage, and the telegraphic speech or two-word stage, and overregularization, which goes with telegraphic speech. So, all right, that's it.